Russia is implicated in a massive cyber attack spree. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Cyber warfare has now become the preferred method of countries waging war against each other. It's a massive concern, and before we even get into the externalities of the matter, I want to begin by outlining a report that came out not too long ago. It has been put forward that Russian hackers have monitored email or other data in several US government departments, and it's being touted as one of the largest data breaches, cyber attacks, whatever you want to call it, in history. CBC writes that the US Treasury Department was among the federal agencies hacked in a wide-reaching cyber espionage campaign tied to a foreign government, which is believed to be Russia, and that's according to the American Department of Homeland Security. The hackers used a variety of methods to infiltrate these government networks, but one method included a software called SolarWinds. Now, fundamentally, SolarWinds is just an IT management software. The hackers used that, though, as a form of Trojan horse, as a backdoor, to hijack the government networks and mainframes and whatnot. What they did was they were able to infiltrate the program's updating software, and they input their own code and created that way to get into the government. So when the government was updating their SolarWinds software, the Russian hackers were a part of that. They had a piece of the code, a piece of the software that gave them access through SolarWinds into these various government frameworks. And we know as well that these government entities were not the only company or organization that used SolarWinds. There's a vast variety of companies and other countries who are caught up in this as well, including Microsoft and Canada. Currently, it is believed that the hackers only monitored data. That is, they read emails and they looked at information, but they didn't alter it. Even though that was within the scope of possibility, they neglected to do so. Perhaps because it would be far more obvious that they got in if one day an intern or someone in the database saw an entry that looked odd to them. All they did was look at things, and while they were doing that, they were erasing the logs too. So it wouldn't show that this random party accessed the data. They were watching it for whoever knows how long, erasing the evidence, and luckily though, somehow last week we caught on to it. The Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Defense Department, these agencies and a bunch of other ones, are now coming forward and saying that they're going to move their communications onto classified networks as a result of the breach. My first question arises right here. Why didn't they do that in the first place? If there are things that you can do to better protect your organization and become more cyber hack proof, it should already be done. It's like me having a roof with a bunch of damage on it. If the roof suddenly implodes and there's a hole now, I've been breached by the elements, well, you could say, yeah, it's the sky's fault for raining that day, but there's also an onus on you on being negligent. I could have fixed that roof a long time ago. The American government could have put measures in place to combat this. It's a two-way game. It's not just Russia's fault, of course, they're the ones who did it. They hacked you. But were you negligent in that process? And this brings to mind another example I keep remembering. I believe it was the American Senate questioning Facebook. When it comes to things like tech, the government is not the best source of insight. They had no idea what Facebook was, how it made money, whatever, very basic questions that even an 18-year-old could answer. And I wonder, the government IT operators and people in charge of security and defense of some of the most valuable, sought-after, classified information, are they operating on industry best standards, best practices? Do they have the best talent available? I'm not too sure that's the case. And if they're now saying, hey, we can actually do something to be better, move these communications onto private channels, the question still rises, why was that not done before? Why was that not thought of before? We knew Russia was playing around with data breaches and committing these cyber warfare atrocities and encroachments on various different government softwares and platforms. It's not a surprise. When I saw the headline that Russia was behind us, that they launched a major cyber warfare crime or act against America, it didn't surprise me. That's par for the course. That's something that we should all already be aware of and planning against, but still, the government seemed to be caught by surprise here. And them saying they could have done something more, because that's essentially what's being communicated here. There are other things that they could have done, but they weren't done before. They're going to do it now. It reeks of incompetence, and perhaps I'm wrong in that regard, but that's the way it appears to me. Now, as mentioned before, Microsoft also confirms that they were hacked as well, via that same SolarWinds methods. And here's where things got complicated. So, it's believed that the scope of these cyber attacks extend beyond America, because once you get into Microsoft, once they get hacked, you basically get everyone. Organizations, companies, governments around the world use Microsoft services. If Russia got into Microsoft, they can see all your data now too. It's reported that Canada, Mexico, Belgium, Spain, Britain, Israel, and the UAE have all been compromised as well. And it's not too clear what data from there has been seen. Has anything been altered? We don't really know. We just know there was a breach and things were definitely looked at, but we haven't been able to pinpoint what exactly, or maybe the government has, but it hasn't been publicly reported. Now, as a result of this, Joe Biden came forward, the president-elect of the United States of America, and he said that he would elevate cybersecurity and disrupt and deter our adversaries from undertaking such major hacks. And here again is the question. First of all, how exactly will he do that? Second, if there are things you can actually do, why were they not done before? Are you surprised that Russia has hacked into government systems? You shouldn't be. And third, how exactly are you going to do, as you have said here, deter your adversaries from undertaking such major hacks? What deterrence? What are you going to do? To actually deter Russia, there has to be consequences right here. If you allow them to hack into government frameworks and the only response America puts forward is a warning, going forward, we're going to deter them. That's not a deterrence. If you want to deter them, you're hitting them with sanctions. You're hitting them with whatever it is, fines, tariffs. You don't probably want to avoid military intervention. Having these massive powerhouses go to war is not desirable. But if there is no form of consequence, you're not deterring anything. I'd be very interested to see what Joe Biden is thinking in terms of deterrence, because it's not very clear based on the statement here. And just another thing, once again harping on the previous point, I'm not too sure if government officials understand what's going on here. I'm not confident that Joe Biden, or anyone for that matter, in politics fully understands what cyber warfare is and how it operates and how to stop it. Of course they have advisors and intellectuals who are helping them to develop a plan, but if your leader doesn't grasp it, it's not a good sign. And I look at Putin from Russia, a previous member of the KGB. I think he's more well versed in this than someone like Joe Biden or Trump. And that's a disadvantage, because although you have the advisors, having the head of state informed and very well aware of what's going on, that's a plus. And I think on the cyber warfare scope, landscape, America, Canada, Europe, they have not shown a strong hand. They have been hacked and they continue to get hacked, and I've seen very little come out of that. Very little learning, very little defense being mounted, and we seem to be at the mercy of Russian hackers, whatever they want to do. Whether they're infiltrating social media, or getting into government networks, or putting out fake news or propaganda, stirring up trouble and conflict, it's happening, and we have not stopped it. It's a major issue and something to think about. Joe Biden acknowledging the problem, saying he wants to do something about it is step one, but I want to see a plan. I want to see you actually go forward and implement a policy or a tactic. How are we going to avoid this? Because it is the defining issue of our current environment, of the current times here. War, physically, invading a country, dropping nukes on them, it's not something that's going to happen between these major powerhouses, because the consequences are far too great. Prior to World War II, of course, there are many casualties, but they were limited in scope. Nowadays, though, with the advent of the nuclear arsenal and these atom bombs, the scope is astronomical. It's actually global. You can destroy an entire country from the confines of the White House or whatever Russia's parliament is where Putin resides. One push of a button. And you can trigger that with something small. If one day you wake up and Russian troops are on the American border, trying to break their way in, Russia is getting nuked, and that's a disaster because Russia will then nuke us. Major problem. That's why cyber warfare has become the proxy now, because the consequences are less severe. The dawn or the age of cyber warfare really has arrived, and there are some things that we perhaps have done to allow that. The first thing is the way we perceive these things versus traditional warfare. So, if you see a headline like Russia has actually shot an American soldier at an embassy or something like that, even just one soldier, even though it's a massive loss and it's tragic, that one headline there will stir up the entire country. Everyone will be angry. People will probably be calling for retaliation. They'll be pushing the government to do something. But you have a headline here that Russia has supposedly committed one of the largest cyber warfare attacks we've ever seen. They've got access to an unbeknownst amount of data and emails from our government sources which were classified and not supposed to be in their hands in the first place. But that has received far less attention. People are not as angry. In fact, it seems like it's been ignored to some extent. There's very little headlines in the news about it. You compare that to what would happen if it was a physical conflict and it'd be everywhere. The ways in which we regard them are different. We don't take the cyber warfare as seriously. Perhaps because we're not visually seeing the consequences. When someone gets shot or someone gets killed, we see the end result there. It's violent. With cyber warfare, we actually continue on our day and we don't see the victim per se. We don't see a dead soldier. We don't see what Russia is doing with the info. All that stuff will come to light after the fact, but that's the issue. We won't know what's happened until it's too late. With this data, with these emails, with this intel they've acquired, it's not clear what they're going to do with it, if anything. Perhaps they use that info to develop, if they got info on weaponry, better arms now, which could be an issue down the line. Perhaps they've found out about classified intel on projects they're working on, and they're going to find ways to deter that now. Perhaps they've found things that can be released to the American people to cause conflict and stir things up. There's a lot of ways this can play out, but because we don't know, because there is a degree of ambiguity to it, the reaction from the public has not been as harsh as probably called for. We know for a fact that in this outbreak of cyber infiltrations and whatnot, it doesn't seem like the hackers went beyond just reading emails, but that's not the potential scope of how dangerous things can be. That's a tip of the iceberg. Let's say Russian hackers infiltrate the government database and perhaps they begin altering data. They make our budget look like we've spent too much already this year and we don't catch on, and therefore we make decisions based on that. We cut services here and there, or it looks like we funded these areas and we haven't. These things are all possible. And even going further, back to this age of nuclear weaponry. It wasn't too long ago where glitches on nuclear radars were determining the fate of humanity. There's a true story about a Russian soldier, and he was watching the radars one evening. I forget his name now, but I've heard the story retold over and over again. You can look it up. On his radar, there was a blip, and the radar was falsely detecting, it was a false positive, a nuclear warhead heading to Russia from America. In reality, there was no such thing, but for some reason, the radar was picking something up. This is the issue with technology. It can glitch out. Now, he had a choice. Does he alert his superiors and fire rockets back? While keeping in mind, too, nothing was actually coming to them, so if they fired rockets back, that would be the first rocket shot. Then the American defense system would pick that up, and they would shoot rockets back. Now, Russia would think they're under attack, and they would retaliate. And America would actually be under attack, and they would retaliate. And it brings up the topic of it's a first strike policy, actually, is what it's called. So, what do you do when a country launches a nuke at you? The response by the American government and many countries around the world with nukes is to say, if you nuke us, we nuke you back. You kill us, we kill you. It's mutually assured destruction. But this time it will be brought on by an accident, given the case I'm talking about. So, that Russian soldier used some intelligence and he said it makes no sense for this to actually be happening. He thought the machine was glitching out, and therefore he said nothing, and because he did that, nothing came of it. He waited and he waited, and eventually he realized nothing was happening, and he was correct in his judgment. But if he did alert the higher-ups and they panicked and they shot something back, that could have very well been the end of the world. Really. We were that close to it. And there were things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, all these examples of us almost destroying humanity. Now, of course, that brings to mind an interesting example. What if Russia figures out how to hack into our defense system because of all these continuous breaches, and they say, hey, let's program their defense radars to say there's an incoming nuke from China or North Korea. And if you actually believe that's happening because they've hacked the frame, they've hacked the software in a way where it's actually showing that on display, the person watching it may not act the same way the Russian soldier did many years ago. They might think it's a legitimate threat and they're going to alert their higher-ups, and the higher-ups might panic and they might fire back. Then once they do that, they've actually initiated the war based on false information. And as Russia, you might actually want that. For America to get into a nuclear battle with China and North Korea. Because once you nuke someone, even if it's based on false information, there is no taking it back. They won't care about that. You've caused the damage and they're going to nuke you back as per their defense policy. And Russia can just hide in the shadows, and that's kind of been what they've been up to. Something of a shadow terror. Russia isn't on the forefront causing problems like China is. China is upfront about their issues with America. The politicians, the government, they're calling them out. They're decrying the acts of Western civilization that they find deplorable. They're doing all of that. Russia, though, very covert. We're hearing reports about this and that, but when it comes to the world stage, Putin is very quiet. He likes to be in the shadows. He likes to be private. He likes to be secretive. He's kind of fanning the flames of what would you call it? Of disconnection, of issues between these various factions around the world. And he actually is set to reap the benefits of that. Nobody would benefit more from the Americans and China going to war than Russia if they can stay out of it. Because in the global landscape, that's the top three. It's America, China, and Russia, probably in that order. If America were to one day fall, the next super world power would likely be China. But if America and China were to fall or diminish, then it would probably be Russia or the EU. There are possibilities here, of course. Canada could join forces with Europe and then create their own superpower. But based on the way things are right now, that's what we're looking at. Those are the big dogs, the big players. And if you had a choice between those three for one country to be this global presence, you definitely want it to be America, despite all their faults and whatnot. And Russia trying to undermine that from the shadows, being covert, data breaches, cyber attacks and whatnot, it really has to be stopped, because I don't think we're appreciating just how dangerous this is and the potential for a disaster that can occur from it. I will also put out too there, Russia is playing this very well. There's something about cyber attacks that gives you this ability to feign ignorance. So going back to traditional warfare, you can't just send in one soldier on his own to take over a country or disrupt it. They'll be captured, they'll be killed, there'll be whatever happening to that. If you actually want to cause a significant amount of damage and uproar, you gotta send in an army or a battalion, a lot of people. If you do that, there is no plausible deniability. That's an organized army coming from Russia. It's the Russian army. If you send in one person, then maybe you can get away with saying they were rogue. We don't know them. How can you blame us for that? It's an individual. Even though we know behind the scenes Russia probably still sent them, but they have that deniability. Something crazy is happening with this age of cyber warfare. It's actually the reverse. One person, one hacker, can cause a massive amount of uproar, can disturb an entire country by themselves from one computer. That's all they really need. You don't need an army of hackers or a battalion. And because you only have that one hacker, let's say we go to Russia tomorrow and say, hey, we've caught you. We're going to impose all these issues. You try it again, we're going to do cyber warfare against you, and you're not going to want that. They could very easily say, hey, what are you talking about? And that's why the reports are saying alleged, because it's hard to prove actually that the Russian government was in fact behind it. We might know it was a Russian hacker, but who's to say? Was it ordered by Putin? Or is it a random guy doing his own thing, not connected to the government? And we know that's unlikely, of course. Definitely, logically, The government is issuing these commands. A regular civilian is not going to take time out of their day to be trying to hack into the government security mainframes in America. There is no incentive, there is no reward there. But the Russian government, though, they can make use of that. But still, they can deny it. They can say it's only alleged, where's your proof and whatnot. And that makes it hard to attack and mount a sort of defense mechanism. Even though we probably all know it to be true, you still can't act based on that. We have certain rules of law, international courts and whatnot, and to be doing something without clear evidence, you might not be well received by the global community. There is an onus on America and the defense departments to bring up some evidence, and that's hard when you're dealing with one hacker who can easily erase his footprints, not like actual soldiers going across the border and trying to take over a country. Things were far easier before. And I'm not even talking too long ago. 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, war was well defined. Today, though, given technology and the uses of cyber warfare, it's getting harder and harder to pinpoint things, and we're not talking about it. I do feel like in this age of cyber warfare, we're not positioned to do too well. We don't have the resources or the intelligence or the knowledge to combat it. But still, our adversaries are very well equipped to utilize it. Their offensive is very strong. Our defensive, not so much, and that's a problem. You have to understand, too, that cyber warfare goes beyond just hacking into the Defense Department and reading their emails. There's also a whole arm of that that's related to fueling division, and we've seen that happen already through social media. Russian bots putting up propaganda. You feel like you're talking to a real person, but they're not. They're a fake, and they're there to sow discord, to sow confusion and chaos. They're spewing fake news, lies, rhetoric. They're dividing the country, and they want to be caught up in the headlines that says Russia interfered with the election. So, there can be conflict. One way to actually conquer a great enemy is to make them fight themselves, to divide them in two. A united America, that's difficult to stop. Almost impossible. That's a massive country with all the best technology, some of the brightest people. They have everything going for them. Wealth, of course they have their issues, but that's humanity. We've always had issues, but they're doing well in combating it. But now you crack them in half, you fracture them. You have half the population hating the other half, not willing to work with each other, making them see themselves as the enemy. Now that's good, from Russia's standpoint. If you're actually plotting to overthrow a country in 2020, this is the way to go. You weaken them. You debase the very notion of truth. You make them fight each other. You make them so violent that the notion of a civil war occurring is actually plausible. Why invade them and use our soldiers when they'll fight each other and destroy themselves? That's the way to go. And we don't realize that. It's very possible we've been played for fools here. There is a question to be asking about, when did things get so toxic? When did you start hating the other side politically? If you trace that back to its origin, sure, probably America had a hand in that themselves, but I guarantee you, Russia, perhaps even China, have played a part as well, through social media. That's become the predominant factor behind this movement here of intolerance and chaos and bitterment. When fake news is a part of every story, when truth is out the window, when people can't even get on the same page about how to handle a pandemic, that doesn't spell well for the future of a country. It doesn't spell well for any form of unity and future that we could have here. And as an enemy, and this is really what gets me, analyze your own behavior as a civilization, as a society. If your enemy would be very happy about the ways you're behaving, what does that tell you about yourself? If you took a snapshot of American culture today, and to a lesser extent Canadian and European culture, and you sent that to China and Russia, and they analyzed it, I think they'd be thrilled. Division is so high, politically, along other lines as well. People are at each other's throats. There's no unity. There's no way to move forward together. We can't even get on the same page about what real threats are and what aren't. That's perfect for them. And if there ever was a time to topple the Western powers, it's looking like it's being presented very fast, and perhaps soon we'll see something occur along those lines. It's a danger. And that line is just the craziest thing to me. If you are behaving in a way that your enemy would approve of, you should look at that. Analyze it. Think about it. If you're behaving in a way that your enemy would not approve of, well, that's perhaps an indication that you're doing something right. And maybe we were behaving in a good way before, and they saw that and things have changed drastically. Social media has become a powerful tool for good, but it's also perhaps the bane of human existence today, at least in the developed world. There's a lot of issues with that, and we've talked about it before. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. There's a lot of good, a lot of utility, but we're sacrificing something else too. And we're not going to fully understand that until it's too late, because social media is going nowhere. It's almost like a psychological experiment has been thrust upon us, and we're now seeing the results of it as we're going through it. And if we don't wisen up and change the ways we're behaving, we're at the mercy of Russia. A unified North America, nobody is standing up to that. A fractured one, though, one that wants to topple its other half, well, that's an easy target. And only time will tell how bad things can get. We're seeing more and more headlines about cyber warfare, hacks, fake news, fraud, division, and whatnot. Things have only begun. And if we don't start talking about it and figuring out a mutual path forward, well, the future might not look too pretty. So, that now brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoy the content, be sure to leave a review and share. They'll help us grow. And you can also find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.